out-of-control sexual behavior.
Whether you call it sexual addiction, sexual compulsivity, hypersexual behavior,
it can have devastating consequences on one's life.
Consequences they may never have imagined for themselves, their families, their friends, and their careers, every area of life.
Research indicates that 3 to 5% of the United States population
could meet the criteria for sexual addiction and compulsivity.
These numbers are based on individuals who seek treatment. Though this is a large number of people,
it is probably a conservative estimate.
Like most diseases, more people suffer from this disorder than actually seek treatment.
This disease is not just a male problem, but a human problem. It affects both men and women.
This is an issue of suffering.
Sexual addiction and compulsivity, or hypersexual disorder,
is an issue of public health, mental health, and risk.
As long as this disease process is undiagnosed,
misunderstood, and overlooked,
it remains out of the line of sight.
Out of the light of day.
It places people of all ages, gender,
creed, race, locale
in silent danger.
The good news, treatment is available.
Treatment works.
For nearly 3 decades, men and women
have entered recovery for sexual addiction and compulsivity.
Their lives have been redeemed and restored.
Their families have been able to heal.
There is life after this disease.
There is help.
And there is hope.
There is a lot unknown about sex addiction. In fact, we still don't agree on the name. However, what we do know is that it is a disorder that can affect everyone: men, women, straight, gay, and it's found in almost every ethnic group. The origins of this disorder are most likely a complex interaction of biological, psychological, and environmental factors. Changes in the brain, genetics, trauma, early life experiences have all been implicated. Each person has their own story, but the story is the same. This is a real problem that affects real people.
Sexual addiction is a process addiction. And what that means is they don't have to ingest any chemicals in order to create the high. So oftentimes we'll see a progression with the behaviors for more intensity, more danger, etc. We also look for consequences.
Okay.
What have these behaviors done to you in your life, the loved ones who are around you? Have you missed opportunities in your career or your education that have cost you time or energy or success?
Well, I don't particularly care much what it's called, because I don't believe it's about sex. It just happens to be the behavior of choice that helps people to manage their feelings. You know, all addictions and compulsive behaviors are about managing feelings. And one of the things that characterizes an addict is an inability to self-soothe and to self-regulate. And like gambling, eating, drinking, drugging, sex helps people to do that.
Well, I think we have a major difficulty in defining what healthy sexuality is. And then the whole notion of sexual addiction and compulsivity encompasses a broad range of behaviors, from simply pursuing relationships compulsively to isolated compulsive masturbation and everything in between. And then it infringes on other people's rights, other people's lives, families, and so forth. So it's really a very complex topic. And then to try to narrow that down to diagnostic criteria of what needs treatment is extremely difficult.
What starts an addiction doesn't necessarily maintain an addiction. If I asked you why you started smoking when you were 15 years old, you might say because it was cool, because my friends were doing it, because I thought it looked manly, I thought it was sophisticated. Whatever your reasons may be, if I say, why are you still doing it at 40 years old? You're not going to say, because I think it's cool, because my friends are doing it. So regardless of what was the initial beginning of that behavior, it does not necessarily mean that today, 10 years, 20 years later, that that's maintaining the behavior still.
Now we're hearing lots of terms. We hear sex addiction, we hear disorder, we hear disease. You use the term disorder. What's the difference and why do you prefer disorder?
I think I'd prefer the term disorder because unlike a disease where we can specify very closely a certain agent and an environment and the damage that that agent does to the environment, whether it be a virus, cells that are replicating out of control, bacteria, a disorder is a constellation of symptoms that have a root, most likely, actually definitely, in neurochemistry. At this point in time, we don't know what those roots are, but we know that there are genetic, neurochemical basis that leads to a constellation of symptoms, and that then gives us a disorder that we can then, at this point in time, describe, even though we may not have the pathophysiologic mechanisms clearly understood.
An addiction is a pathological or unhealthy relationship with a substance or a behavior that a person does, even in the face of negative consequences.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about the DSM? We know that sex addiction, compulsivity, whatever we might want to call it, is not in the DSM, and that affects a lot. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think the progress of getting this disorder put into the DSM is probably one of the more important things that we can focus on. What the DSM allows is a systemized, categorized way of looking at this disorder. It's not to throw labels, it's not to pigeonhole, but it's a way so that if I'm talking to a therapist across the country, we're on the same page. And we know that we're on the same page because we're using criteria that through the research literature has been substantiated through a variety of different studies, whether they be biologic studies, sociodemographic studies, observational studies. The point is, the DSM tries to capture that and provide consistent criteria so that we have some form of validity for the diagnosis.
For some people, putting a label on it brings intense shame, and yet for other people, being able to say, hey, there is a disorder and it has this name, suddenly it brings hope to them. From that point, they think, hey, this is not just me being a person of poor character or having bad morals. There's actually something wrong, and if there's something wrong, I can get help.
Sex addiction and all addiction is a brain disease. And as we begin to explore our understanding of neuroscience and we have the ability to do more research, we're seeing more and more that addictive disorders are not moral failures. They are diseases.
I think understanding how intensely the brain is involved is key. Because for a drive that feels so good, sexual arousal feels good. Absolutely. And so understanding how prevalent that is in everyday life, how difficult that struggle is, and matching that with the brain and what it is doing is essential in terms of making sure that we're treating the whole person and the whole process and not one or two specific behaviors. I think the label we put on it is less important than the goals of healthy recovery and a healthy lifestyle, being able to be free of the bondage and the binds that they put themselves in and eliminate the consequences. If we put a good label on it, if we have a number to attach to it, that's really convenient and that makes the process easier, but I think that it doesn't change the treatment significantly.
The consequences of this disorder can touch all aspects of one's life. These can include loss of friends, social isolation, loss of income, loss of job advancement, arrest, loss of licensure, sexually transmitted disease including HIV, pregnancy, loss of family, child custody issues, loss of marriage or partner, loss of time with children, depression, anxiety, guilt, shame, self-loathing, lack of connection, embarrassment, poor academic or job performance, and the list goes on.
In my own life, I had been having affairs and acting out with people. I was a flight attendant, and it was really easy for me to have a separate life that was totally secret. He had no way of knowing what was going on. And, that was a part of my history, and I got to the place where I had no, my value system was inherited. It wasn't holding me up. And I ended up having no integrity at that point. And you know, the good news is I feel like the God of my understanding intervened on me and said, cut it out. You can't keep doing this. You got to get honest.
I think the biggest hurdle people have is they have so much shame attached to this. Unlike having depression, being able to go and talk to someone about sexual acting out is very shame-based. Very much like alcoholism was 50, 60 years ago. We have so many moral judgments on people's behavior that shame keeps people from getting help.
Many times people come in and they want to know, why am I doing this? And there's such a variety of reasons. And research has shown that approximately 84 to 86% of all the, at least the men that we work with, have had early history of trauma. And in cases of trauma, we find that people on an unconscious level repeat the trauma. They just keep repeating it and repeating it, I think with a hope of mastering the trauma.
What about female sex addicts? Are they different than male sex addicts?
Well, they have a lot of things that are very similar. I think what we see with female sex addicts is that most often the relationship issue is a huge one. A lot of times people talk about love addiction or relationship addiction instead of sex addiction. That's not to say that there aren't women who don't use sex in some of the similar ways that we traditionally see men to use it. Access to sexuality that we have with the internet now, whether it's pornography or hooking up with somebody or going online with cameras, and we see women engaging more and more in behaviors that get to be addictive in nature. And so while we used to say only about 10% of those folks that we see were women, we see those numbers coming up and up and up.
When we start trying to separate it out, I look for, how is this interfering with your life? How is it disrupting your goals for your life, for your family, and for your career? And from there, we can usually find the difficulty that needs to be addressed.